I'm Leon Todd for G66. Welcome to another Tuesday Tone Tip. On today's video, I want to show you how to recreate two of my favorite compact effects pedals from Boss, the Dimension Chorus and the SDE3 Dual Delay. I did a video over on my channel a couple of weeks ago where I was using those two pedals for an instant 80s tone combination. And like a lot of Boss pedals, they have a very limited feature set, but what they do sounds great and is easy to use. Of course, a question that I got was, is it possible to recreate that on a fractal device? And I'm going to show you exactly how I go about doing that. We're going to start off by running the chorus block set to the Dimension 2 mode on here into a dual delay. I'll let you hear it with a crunch sound and a clean sound on here. Then we will break down how I've dialed it in. I'll also show you a couple of other combinations that I really like on here. I'm using a Les Paul Custom into the Brit 800-2203 and my free cab IR on the Axe FX3. I've got the VP4 in an effects loop of the Axe FX3. Let's hear the crunch sound and then the clean. Much like the real pedals and the rack units that those pedals are based on, we're getting a lovely sense of width from the Dimension Chorus in there, and then the dual delay is adding some depth and some space. Not too dissimilar to what we might get out of a reverb, but with discrete echoes. It's a little easier to stop it from getting washed out on there. Play around with the mix control on the dual delay, and you can use it as an always-on rhythm guitar effect or crank it up if you want a glorious lead style effect on there. Now, I've pulled both of these settings from my VP4 blocks library, which I'll link below, but let's take a very quick overview of the settings on there. I'm using the Dimension 2 mode on here. So there are three different dimension types in here, dimension 1, 2, and 3. They each correspond to a different dimension mode. So the Boss Dimension pedal just has a bunch of buttons on there. There's no knob, so you don't have to worry about balancing out the rate and chorus. You can think of them as having different chorus presets on there. There's also a little bit of filtering and some very clever stereo processing on there that makes a Dimension Chorus sound like a Dimension Chorus on there. I've gone for the rate a little over 0.6 hertz. I believe the spec for the original Dimension rack unit for one of the modes is 0.5 hertz. So you can start there as a default. Now, I have set the depth quite low on here, and the reason being is that in Expert Edit, I have turned auto depth off. I find that just gives me slightly more control. The default setting for the dimension types is to have auto depth set to low, in which case start with the depth around 50 to 60% on here. One great thing about the dimension mode in the VP4, the Axe FX, the FM9 and FM3 is that you're not just limited by pressing a single button on there. You can set the rate to whatever you want and the depth to whatever you want. So if I add a lot of distortion on here, this is using the FAS Stealth Blue amp on the Axe FX, I might actually turn that rate down a little bit just to get a more subtle widening effect. Let's hear that. also played around with the different dimension modes on there. Let's hear the difference between low and high, for example, on there. My personal preference is medium on there, but again, use this to taste. You might prefer high when you're using a clean sound on there. You might prefer low on a dirty sound. One thing that I love about the Dimension Chorus is it is essentially a chorus effect for people who don't really like chorus. Another great alternative to this is using some dual detune or quad detune in the pitch block. But for now, we're going to roll with those settings. So rate somewhere between 0.5 and 1 hertz. Depth quite low if you've got auto depth off. Otherwise, start with the depth at 50% and just play around with the different dimension mode or the dimension type on there, and you will get really close to the sound of that classic Boss pedal or Roland rack unit. Let's do this. Let's go to the dual delay now, because I've based these on the classic Eddie Van Halen settings where Eddie would be using a pair of Roland SDE 3000 rack units. Basically what I found was if you set one of the delays a little bit lower than 800 milliseconds and one of the other delays a little bit lower than 400 milliseconds, it sounds a lot like the first preset on the SDE 3000 EVH pedal. I've just played around with the feedback and the panning on there in the EQ section as well. I've gone for a high cut at 8 kilohertz. That's just where I like it. You can set that one a lot higher if you like. It might sound a little closer to the pedal, but these are great dual delay settings on here. You know, you could go for 400 and 800, 300 and 600, stuff like that. I like having this slight offset between them though, because it means the delays kind of won't collide with one another. There's that subtle difference in there. So let's have a listen to just the delay on the lead sound. That's absolutely glorious. That is so great for high gain 80s inspired lead playing. The SDE3 pedal, however, is great as just a standard mono digital delay. So I would recommend starting with the vintage digital type if you want to emulate those settings. I've gone for just a little over 300 milliseconds of delay, feedback, and mix to taste. Let's actually take the mix to 50% because I'm going to be using a clean sound for this one. This is a great sounding rhythmic delay. What we're going to do after this is I'll show you a way to maintain that same rhythmic sound, but basically make the delay sound a whole lot wider. Let's have a listen. It's just a great sounding rhythmic delay on there. You can either dial in the time to taste or you can tempo sync it. So you could set a dotted eighth note, tap the tempo in and have all your delays synced up. One really nice trick that you can do with something like the vintage digital delay is in Expert Edit, go to the right post delay setting and dial in a very small delay offset. Let's hear the difference between having that set at 0, like we heard before, and then say adding 3 milliseconds of offset delay on there. Make sure you're listening in That very very small delay offset makes all the difference on there, and it can make the delay sound so wide in stereo, perfect for those 80s tones. Of course, if you take this delay sound and combine it with the dimension chorus, it's just glorious. I've set the delay for a slightly longer delay time on there. I've gone for 400 milliseconds, and we get this. Now, if you really wanted to go for the 80s clean sound, you could actually do it all in the box with the VP4. I've taken those dimension, chorus, and delay settings that we had there. I've added the Rock Guy compressor, compression and tone cranked up on there. I've even just added a little bit of the large hall reverb at the stock settings on there. So this is guitar straight into the VP4, straight to the audio interface, no post-processing. And it's a pretty magic combination, especially if you're chasing those glorious 80s tones. If you've got any questions, please let me know in the comments section below. I'll put a link to my blocks library and my free IR in the video description, and I'll see you all on next week's Tuesday Tone Tip. Let's hear this DI VP4 sound.